Hello everybody, it's Dr. Jensen and this is Module 4, Media and Crime Fighters Part 3. So we're going to be talking about the CSI effect and getting some resolution on this topic for this module. So first we will talk about what the CSI effect is, media portrayals of the CSI effect, and then the many effects of CSI, particularly on the court and jury process. So what is the CSI effect? Well, the basic premise is that it's a media depiction of a law effect on jurors' judgments in real cases. So essentially, you watch CSI, you start to develop different ideas about how crime scene investigation works and how evidence should be presented and collected and how it fits into a crime event and a crime scene. So most of the focus when we look at CSI and how it's portrayed is on what we call a strong prosecutor's effect. So we'll go into these effects in more detail. But jurors will have an unrealistic expectation about the type of evidence available in trial. Because of these expectations, there is an increased probability of jurors having reasonable doubt and acquitting, feeling like they don't have enough to convict. It also comes up through anecdotal evidence where we hear from courtroom work group, from judges, from prosecutors and defense attorneys to say, hey, I think there's something going on here to influence my jury. We do also have a lack of empirical evidence in the media claims to show what's going on. So we're going to talk all about these things in a few moments. But you do have a few articles to look at for this module to be considering in all of this and thinking about how it works. So first let's look at the media portrayals of the CSI effect. So media reports declare that there is no debating the reality of the CSI effect and that the storylines are fiction, but their effect is actually real. The CSI effect was actually a term that was coined in 2002 in Time magazine. And it captured the attention of local and national newspapers, U.S. News and World Report, Scientific American, National Geographic, and you started to see it everywhere. So between 2005 and 2008, there were 242 articles published on the CSI effect. The use of more sophisticated crime scene investigation tools really more prominently came about in the 80s and 90s, but we started to look at the TV show coming out in the late 90s and early 2000s really kind of saturating the media landscape with this. So we're going to look at an article by Cole and Diosovilla in 2009 where they talk about what the effects are. So first we have the strong prosecutor's effect, which is the most common one. So this is one you want to know best. It has an effect on jurors, meaning that they will acquit in cases in which they would have convicted had CSI never existed. So again, it's having these unrealistic expectations about what should be presented in court and how it should work, meaning that the prosecutor is not getting a conviction like they had expected. In the weak prosecutor's effect, it has an effect on prosecutors themselves where they actually make adjustments accounting for this CSI phenomena going on. So essentially, it's training and compensating for absence or weakness in forensic evidence and also changing the voir dire strategy. Now, you'll remember maybe from other criminology classes, voir dire literally means to see the truth or to say the truth, and it's a French term that we use for jury selection. So jury selection is when judges, prosecutors, and defense get to take turns at striking out each other's potential jurors, looking for biases, and essentially whatever's left over is supposed to be an unbiased, impartial jury. So they're going to be asking different kinds of questions about whether or not they have a fascination with CSI and some of these kinds of things to try to account for that ahead of time. We also have a defendant's effect, and the defendant effect is on jurors, where it affords greater credibility to forensic expert witnesses more than they really should have. And it loses the ability to evaluate forensic science properly. And this has to do with scientific literacy of the jury. It also is not able to weigh bad forensic science heavily against good or more impartial forensic science. And so this is where we start to believe more than we should, and we don't bring in proper validity, reliability, and skepticism when looking at forensic evidence. We also have what we call a producer's effect or an amateur scientist effect, and this also affects jurors. Jurors believe they know more about forensic science than they actually do, and to really be able to go into this in more detail, we're going to have a section in this lecture on DNA. A few more effects to go over. We have the educator's effect, and this is an effect on students where they are attracted to careers in forensic science, and they have unrealistic expectations about forensic science careers and sometimes choose the wrong majors to try to pursue them. And they don't understand the science properly and the training needed to do well in them. And so sometimes we see an influx of people that want to do DNA analysis in a criminology major, and I tell them, you're going to be in a lab. You need expertise in biology, chemistry, and or if you maybe want to do ballistics, you need more expertise in physics. And I mean, those are other fields that will provide more sufficient training than you would find in criminology. So you sometimes get an influx of majors because of fascination with the show. You also have the police chief's effect and the criminal's effect, and this affects criminals. It trains criminals to engage in countermeasures to avoid detection through forensic science. So they might bleach a scene or use gloves with everything they do to avoid leaving fingerprints or carefully cover up their presence. We don't really find much evidence to suggest this in research, but there's a perception that it exists out there. We also have what's called the tech effect, and this effect is on jurors, where we hold higher expectations for forensic science and expect more forensic science than is reasonably there. And we're going to talk about this in a moment as well, where we believe that technology is infallible and everything is sufficient and crime scenes are just filled with all kinds of evidence just ripe for the picking, and often that is not reality. The final effect we will talk about is the victim's effect, which again affects crime victims, where a victim expects forensic testing for all crime. And the reality is forensic testing is complicated, time-consuming, and incredibly expensive. And often these costs are not assumable by a police department or even a city, unless the case is high profile or the media get involved and fund some efforts to bring it forward, which happened in the Casey Anthony case with ABC. You also find sometimes the victim's family or other people donate to try to get evidence analyzed that previously could not be. So there definitely is an effect there. But as you can see, most of the effect is on the juror as far as what they think is going to happen before evidence is brought to trial. Now in the Tyler article, it also has a discussion of possible jury effects to be on the lookout for. So CSI also promotes the need for closure. It also identifies the fact that humans prefer an ending in which good guys win and the bad guys are punished, having beliefs in a just world and everyone receiving their just desserts. I'm just highlighting the Tyler article. I would not use this to replace the reading in your preparation for your assessments and assignments. So just make sure you also take good reading notes as you read it. CSI type shows satisfy this desire for justice. It may actually translate to wanting closure of using a guilty verdict where we should not have rendered someone guilty. And it is also not congruent with the strong prosecutor's effect or the defendant's effect. And so we don't see them line up as well. A few other possible jury effects include an overbelief in the probative scientific value of evidence, that it's, infallible and perfect when often we have problems with contamination and some of those kinds of things. Jurors are already not great at evaluating scientific evidence, and this just exacerbates that problem. They already overestimate the reliability of scientific evidence, and CSI may exaggerate this by encouraging a myth of scientific infallibility, which we mentioned, and again, congruent with the defendant's effect. A few other possible jury effects: creating a one-sided view of the law and how it works, and jurors who watch CSI may see the trial as a formality, but having all the conviction wrapped up in the lab. So again, not exactly how that works. So just a few other ideas I want to put out there when we look at how this works on the jury side. First, we need to make sure we highlight this, the reckoning of modern forensic science. Since a series of high-profile legal challenges in the 1990s increased scrutiny of forensic evidence, a range of long-standing crime lab methods have been deflated or even outright debunked. And you're going to see more of this in the module. We also have what we call the DNA wars, where we introduced this technology to the American legal system, and it was actually by no means smooth. Defense attorneys protested that DNA typing did not pass the Frye test, which was a legal standard that requires scientific evidence to have earned widespread acceptance in its field. It is much more highly accepted now than it was in 1996. However, it has its challenges and problems. Labs are often not validated and sometimes have unreliable results and can be influenced. And so we still have this challenge today. So let's talk about DNA evidence. Some of the challenges with it, because this is usually what comes to people's minds when they talk about the CSI effect. So first, you can actually improperly analyze DNA evidence, and we'll talk about why that happens. DNA samples can be contaminated at the point of collection, in transit to the crime lab, and it can invalidate evidence. Not all DNA evidence is actually analyzed. It's very costly and time intensive, and you get very complex mixtures of studying alleles, which is the markers on a DNA sample that start to identify people. And it really is an interpretive art. Since early developments, we've seen more sophisticated computer matching, but it still requires a little bit of subjectivity in making sure the matches are sufficient. We also have rates of transfer when we start moving stuff around. The mere presence of DNA at a crime scene shouldn't be enough for a prosecutor to obtain a conviction. We need context, especially if the scene has a lot of different people inside it, if it's a public area. In the journal Criminal Justice Ethics, it notes that in North Carolina, state and local law enforcement agencies who are operating crime labs were compensated $600 for DNA analysis that resulted in a conviction. So right there we have some corruption maybe going on. And you're like, well, how's that corruption? They're just getting rewarded for good science and good practice. And it's like, well, should science be rewarded in that way? Doesn't that put pressure on the analysts to make sure they do it right, or maybe even taint what they're turning in so they can get that bonus? So we have to think about some of those things. DNA evidence also, again, has the subjectivity, and this is where you can get invalid results. So standards vary, training levels vary, and quality varies as far as how many times it is quality checked. We often use DNA evidence for exonerations for wrongful convictions. If the evidence is still available, sometimes it's not. We also use it for cracking cold cases by reprocessing evidence that was once dismissed as inconclusive, again, should the evidence be available. We have seen that in 75% of jurors who were questioned in a recent study, they said they expected DNA evidence in rape cases. Nearly half said they expected it in murder or attempted murder cases, and 22% said they expected DNA evidence in every criminal case, which again kind of says, well, what's a reasonable expectation, and how much is this going to cost, and how accurate is it? Again, highlighting that problem of scientific literacy with the jury. Judges are far and away not the best people who are qualified to explain science to a jury of lay people who may or may not be keen on these kinds of things, even though they've watched CSI and they have some idea of how it works. Generally speaking, when it comes to fingerprinting, computers don't make matches like they do on CSI. People actually do. And again, looking for markers. So have we seen these CSI claims before? Yes, we have one called the Perry-Mason effect, where prosecutors complained that juries were hesitant to convict defendants without that Perry-Mason moment of a confession on the stand, where people wanted the drama or felt like they deserved to see a confession, or that a confession hadn't been made so they can't convict. We also see some claims of a CSI effect on the People's Court, where we see swift justice, making jurors unsatisfied with the criminal justice system and how typically slow it is. In the O.J. Simpson trial and the Menendez brothers effect, the media discussed the idea of jurors becoming acquittal prone. And there actually are a lot of articles that will look at this to see how this works. And then does this actually create a litigation explosion where we're analyzing everything and becoming lawsuit happy and so forth. Not as much as maybe people make it out to be. But these are some interesting claims to take note of that your chapter also mentions. So we're going to continue with a little more CSI effect stuff. It's kind of the pivotal moment in this class, and we'll see you next time.